Hi, Dr. K. Welcome. Today, I'm really excited, as always, to talk to you. And today we have yet another really important topic that many families probably don't know that much about. It's an issue that you see relatively commonly in a certain population of children that contributes to some of their behavioral issues or maybe some developmental issues. And it's hormonal imbalances in kids. So I'm excited to dive into this because, like I said, it's a topic that's really important, but that many parents don't know that much about, including myself. And both of my boys do have some hormonal issues that we're now addressing through you. So it's been, a learning experience for me, and I'm excited to learn more.
Well, thank you for bringing this conversation forward.
Yeah.
There's such a need. And I feel myself very fortunate because I'm one of the few that actually was able to get training in this entire world of hormones and how plants can be used to balance the hormones.
Right.
Especially since my mentor, Dr. Katiraei, is a pediatrician himself. He had a lot of interest in how hormones impact kids. So
yeah.
Over years of training and discussion, there was a lot of wisdom that he passed on to me, and I'm excited to be sharing this with your audience.
Okay, so one question that I have, and that I'm sure lots of parents have, is what exactly are you looking for when you're assessing for hormonal imbalances in children?
Well, before we talk about that, let's actually kind of paint a picture of what the hormones do and how they influence us, because I think that this is an area that's greatly overlooked, especially in our practice of medicine, and especially in sensory issues and behavioral issues in kids. And this is obviously the area that we're most passionate about.
Right.
And, first, I think to zoom out, in medicine, especially with endocrinologists and pediatricians in conventional medicine, what we're taught is to look for catastrophes, right? We're looking for the things that will kill someone. We're looking for the things that are hugely abnormal. So, for instance, as a pediatrician, if I've got a kiddo who hasn't yet talked, let's say they're 3 or 4 years old, they're not growing, their teeth hasn't come in, their hair is not growing, and you're like, wow, that's a sickly child.
Yeah.
And you say, oh, maybe they have hypothyroidism. Or, in an adult, for instance, if someone's eyes are bulging out, their blood pressure is going through the roof, they've got anxiety, they've got tachycardia, a big grocer, you're just like, whoa, there's something wrong with you, dude. Like that kind of a picture that we say, oh, maybe they're hyperthyroid.
Right.
We look for big anomalies, and anything outside of those big catastrophes or disasters, we say is normal.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how physicians are taught to think. And, God bless them because they do save people's lives by looking for these big catastrophes. The problem is that anything outside of a catastrophe is technically normal. And when you think about that, you realize, maybe what's considered normal is not optimal, right?
Right. Yes.
Before that there's this entire discussion about how do we optimize the system, and especially with the kiddos who have various kinds of behavioral issues and sensory issues and anxiety. When we allow them to get into an optimal place, when they feel vibrant and they're healthy and they're just feeling good, that naturally washes away the behaviors.
Right.
So it begs the question of, is normal necessarily optimal? And that's really the conversation kind of that we need to have.
Right.
And to zoom out, in medicine, I think there's a lot of gaps in our understanding of hormones. So for instance, if you type in thyroid hormones, thyroid hormone and immune system, for instance, there are tons of articles talking about how the thyroid hormones not only impact our energy and metabolism, but actually have a profound influence on the immune system. And there are kids who have weird immune issues that, while we're focusing on the gut and all of these things, the gut is actually not where their immune issues are coming from. It's actually their thyroid hormones. I don't know if you as a mom, when you were pregnant, experienced this, but I have tons and tons of moms that while they're pregnant, they can eat every food under the sun. They can eat as much gluten and dairy and this and that as they want. They're absolutely fine. And then once the baby is born, 2 or 3 weeks later, bam, all of a sudden their guts fall apart. That's the influence of progesterone. It turns out that progesterone actually has this profound anti-inflammatory effect, especially on the gut and on the immune system as a whole. The dendritic cells, which are the kind of the master signalers of the immune system that ultimately control all the other ones, are like the quarterbacks in a way. The quarterbacks of the immune system actually happen to have receptors for progesterone, and when we have good amounts of progesterone, the quarterbacks are just kind of chilled out. They're like, I don't think I'm going to trip out today. I think I'm just going to be happy and smiling.
Sorry.
And these hormones are influencing everything. I mean, like, a perfect example is if you just as a parent watch your kids and their growth, and kids go to sleep and they wake up literally the next day a different human being. How does that change happen? It doesn't happen on its own. I mean, we think it does. We don't really stand back and really question, like, how is it that these kids metamorphosize in a way from one human being to another, sometimes overnight. That's the influence of the hormones. And when you look at it in that light, you come to realize that the most hormonal human beings on the face of the planet are actually kids. You know, we think of women at that time of month, we think of like pregnancy, we think of these things, but the reality is that actually kids, especially for instance right around 2 or 3 years of age, they have these massive hormonal surges. You know, we recognize it in teenager. Teenagers are super hormonal human beings. But we don't recognize it in the 2-year-old, the 3-year-old, the 5-year-old. It turns out that a lot of the things, for instance, like tantrums, the terrible twos, tantrums that kids have, those are actually hormonal.
That's so interesting. Maybe that's where the term three-nager comes from. I've heard that so many times, like that it's not the terrible twos, it's the threes. And what you're saying is it could possibly be related to this kind of surge in hormonal activity, which is so interesting. So hormones have this huge impact on behavior, whether you're 2 years old, 13 years old, 25 years old, or, you know, a woman in menopause, that we don't give them kind of enough credit for what an enormous impact they have on our whole system, including our immune system.
You know, here's a perfect example. Let's just look at this now, put it into actual concrete context. Look at the mind of a 3-year-old, especially when they're having tantrum, right? They're highly emotional, right? They get kind of flipped out and they start crying sometimes for no reason. You're like,
what just happened?
2 inches,
right.
Losing your mind. And on top of that emotional ability, they have this kind of OCD-ness right about them, right? They get wrapped up in their own thoughts, and sometimes when, especially they're tantruming, they keep repeating the same thing over and over again. So 3-year-olds tend to have a little bit of this OCD-ness. The other thing that's really cool about a lot of the 3-year-olds is there's a lot of imagination, right? They're in this imaginary phase. High imagination, high creativity. They have imaginary friends. They make stuff up all the time. When you really pay attention to that, and then you follow now the 8-year-old who's having OCD, anxiety, and you drill down into it, what is so fascinating is I'd say about 30% of the time, the kids that I work with, the same pattern that was there in the 3-year-old is still there in the 8-year-old, the 10-year-old, the 12-year-old.
Right.
That same OCD-ness, that same kind of repetitive patterns of thinking, that same emotional ability actually never went away.
Well, that's you're describing Hunter. Really, essentially, that is Hunter, and so many families who I work with have kids who kind of fit this sort of pattern, where, like you're saying, the tantrums are explosive, they're intense, there's a rigidity to the thinking, there's this quality where the child just gets stuck on something and they cannot move away from it. They just, it's that OCD, like just over and over and over, and they can't let it go. And there's this intensity to it that is not quite in the range of normal. It's sort of out of the bounds of normalcy, or out of bounds. And that is certainly how Hunter was when he was a little guy. And that continued for him. And of course, as I think for a lot of kids, I mean, sometimes it gets worse, but for some kids, as you know, if they're getting intervention and they're getting support, these things improve. Like Hunter definitely improved over the years, but never to a point where it was like, oh, okay, he's not kind of burdened by this anymore. It was like, oh, he's doing better, but wow, this is still really impacting his functioning as a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old, an 8-year-old. So we've experienced that firsthand. And so what you're describing is related to thyroid function. Is that where you, okay, yeah, so.
Exactly. And, the part that's really important to stress is that these kids, Hunter included, are not hyperthyroid. They're not hypothyroid by classical standards. So when you measure their labs, you will actually see what is probably a normal thyroid stimulating, or TSH.
Right.
But the way to re-examine or reconsider this situation is TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone, is like an accelerator. It pushes on the thyroid gland to actually pump out thyroid hormones. Now, for one body or one person, the amount of thyroid activity that they need may be the equivalent of they need to run at 85 miles an hour if you're imagining your kid as a car. Right?
Okay.
And another person actually has a set point of 55 miles an hour. TSH, the only thing it tells us is how hard the body is pushing on the thyroid accelerator. That's all it says. It says, for instance, if TSH is 4, that means that you're pushing 3/4 of the way down on the accelerator, right? And if your TSH is 1, it means that you're pushing 1/4 on the accelerator. That's all it tells us.
Right.
You think about it like that, you start realizing what the limitations of the testing that we do is. Because if we were talking about things in terms of like performance, and the only data we can get was, well, you're pushing on the accelerator this amount, and if you got really fancy, you can measure the thyroid hormones, which are basically how much effort the engine is putting out.
Are regular labs that someone would get from their pediatrician or even adult would get from their GP, they tell a portion of the story when it comes to hormones, but they are missing a pretty big part of the picture. And one of the hormones that is really important is the TRH hormone. And I personally have never heard of that before. So, and I've had my thyroid tested lots and lots of times, and no one has ever said anything about the TRH hormone or what that is or why it's important. So I'm very curious.
These are the little nuances that, if you go and crack open a physiology or even type in thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH, you see that there's articles like the science exists.
Right.
It's not like we're making this stuff up, but what's weird is because, for instance, we can't measure TRH, and we've presumed that TSH is sufficient, then we say, well, that hormone doesn't really matter. It turns out that it kind of really matters because it turns out that TRH is the hormone that, for instance, when it's out of balance, causes this weird emotional lability. So kids that, for instance, go from being fine to suddenly crying for no reason, that's actually an influence of TRH. And there are these patterns. They're very, very obvious when you know how to look for them.
Right.
So, and they come in clusters. This is the cool part because parents can look and say, oh my God, this is my kid.
Yes.
So, for instance, if you've got a kiddo who is emotionally labile and they're just like any little thing sets them off, and it's just this drama, right? Except it's not drama, it's hormonal. They're not just trying to be a pain in your butt. They're actually hormonally influenced.
Charged.
So if you've got this emotional ability, if all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, but if you see this OCD-ness where I kind of give the analogy of your kid's brain a broken record, if the same thought keeps landing in their head, landing in their head, landing in their head, and this is the part that's kind of interesting about anxiety. And when I work with parents, I kind of tease out, well, what's causing your kid to be anxious?
Yeah.
There are a multitude of reasons.
Right.
And it turns out that some kiddos who have OCD, where they perseverate on the same thought, sometimes that perseveration, for instance, shows up as separation anxiety or as anticipation anxiety. So the kids that, for instance, there's a test a week ahead and they're already freaking out over that test.
Right.
Anticipation anxiety, what is that? It's overthinking of the thing, the same thing over and over and over again, to the point where the child has thought about the 50 million possibilities that probably will never happen.
Right.
And I'm sure there's some adults out there that are like, wait a second. That's
well, me. I'm all, this is sounding very familiar. Yeah. Totally. And for sure, with Hunter, I see that. And in a lot of kids who have sensory issues, who fit this kind of framework that Hunter falls into, where I've seen it so many times now. Like you said, it's like, okay, this is a pattern that's not uncommon. There is this tendency to get so stuck on things where they cannot let things go. And I think I was already telling you about this example, but something that happened not too long ago with Hunter was, my husband told him he would play Roblox with him, which is like the new favorite thing in our household. And Hunter was so excited about it. Well, at the last minute, there was a work emergency for August, and he literally, he had to tend to it. His server crashed, and it was like a big deal. So he's like, "Bud, I can't play right now, but I'll play with you as soon as I'm done." So it wasn't like, "Hey, I'm just not going to play with you." It was just like, "I can't do it right this moment when you were expecting me to, but I will later." Hunter fell apart, and he could not let go. And he kept repeating the same thing over and over. "But Daddy said he was going to play with me. He said he was going to play." He literally was on a loop saying that. And there was no amount of logic or reasoning that I could use with him. He was just so fixated and stuck. And this went on for a good 45 minutes, hour. I mean, crying about it, repeating over and over. And I'm like, this is not typical. It's typical for a child to be disappointed, upset, maybe have a reaction, and then be able to move on, especially when, it's like, it's not that this whole experience has now been thwarted. Like, you will be able to play in an hour, just not right this moment. So I think that is a common pattern that you see in sensory kids, where they get so fixated and stuck. And it doesn't matter how much reasoning or logic or bargaining or trying to explain, they can't move on. And so that seems like exactly what you're talking about in this kind of thyroid situation. Yeah.
And, I think it's important for parents to realize that you can't really apply cognitive behavioral tools in situations, because the kid is checked out.
Totally.
They're on another planet.
Totally.
You cannot communicate or rationalize with a child who is completely irrational in that moment, and they're so lost in their own thoughts that literally they might as well have gone to the moon, and they're like, almost half an hour.
Right.
I'm going to flip out of my mind on the moon, and when I'm done, I'll be back.
Yes.
So this is where, there's a lot of discussions, and there are a lot of valuable tools. You know them better than I, of how, you can use this tool or talk to your kid in that way or whatever. When the child is in a hormonal storm, when they're in this stuck phase of perseveration over their thought, there is no rational mind for you to communicate with to actually help them come out of it.
Right.
And I think this is one of the really most important things for us to realize. When kids have these hormonal dysregulations, if you want to say, or imbalances, the kids are really trapped in a hormonal storm that they cannot connect you through.
Yeah.
And that's part of what drives me to bring forward this information in education, because there's a lot of parents that you talk to them more than I do. They're like, we can't rationalize with our kid, we can't communicate with our kid.
Or and it makes me think, when a parent sees that their child is struggling with what they are considering anxiety, which, is such a general word. But when the parent sees, generally you would talk to your pediatrician, but you would then see a therapist, and so many therapists who specialize in treating anxiety are using things like cognitive behavioral techniques, which are helpful to some extent for adults, but I think when the issues are, and like you said, there's so many things that can cause anxiety, and it's sort of a matter of teasing apart what is this rooted in? Is this something that just sprang up on the heels of some kind of emotionally traumatic experience? That's one thing. Or is this something that I have seen in my child since he was a toddler that has followed him throughout his development? Then that's another type of anxiety, and they should be treated differently. So for the child like Hunter, if I were to take Hunter to a therapist and she was going to teach him some cognitive behavioral tools, it wouldn't really move the needle that much. And then I think what happens on top of that, and I think this is more so for kids as they're getting older, maybe into the preteen, teenage years, they're being brought to a therapist, they're being taught, and then they're feeling like there must be something seriously wrong with me. I can't even use these tools. And then there's like this added layer of shame on top of it, of like, what's wrong with me? The help that is supposed to be helping me isn't helping. It must be me. And these poor kids already have such, their self-esteem has already got a lot of holes poked in it, and I think this is so helpful for parents to hear that if your child does have this pattern, and what you're saying is this probably, if you think back in your child's development, you could go, oh yeah, as a toddler, my child did have these crazy tantrums. My child does get really stuck on things, can't move on, tends to repeat the same thing over and over. No matter what I do, it doesn't help when he's kind of in that hormonal storm. Not that they know what that is at the time, but I think as parents go back in their child's development, they can kind of see these things. So what are the other pieces of that puzzle in terms of that pattern?
Perfect question. And I just want to go back to the thing. It breaks my heart. It makes me so sad when I see how we blame the kids and their families for what is happening. Because we believe that the kids are in control of their behaviors, or that the parents are the ones that haven't parented well enough.
Right.
And it's tragic because it's not the parents' fault. It's not the kids' fault. The best way to conceptualize what's happening is you've got a wild, untamed, crazed bronco, that is just kicking and jumping, and there's this wild, 1,000-pound horse that is literally just going amok. And now you're asking this poor kid, climb on top of this horse, stay on this horse, and now we want you to control this horse. And then the kid keeps getting flung off.
Right.
And their leg's broken because they got flung off 1,000 times, and we're just like, get back on that horse. And parents, you need to teach your kid how to get back on that horse, and you need to tame that horse.
Right.
Well, maybe the thing we need to do is first figure out how to chill out that bronco and turn it into a nice, gentle pony that the kid can get on and actually be able to ride. And, cognitive behavioral tools are awesome. Parenting tools are awesome. And I think every parent whose kid has behavioral issues, they should have someone in their team that helps them figure out how to communicate with their child.
Right.
We also need to think like, hey, there's a crazed bronco that is 1,000 pounds and really powerful that is kicking this kid off.
Right.
Let's calm that thing down. And that is actually the mind of these kids. It's this wild, chaotic bronco that the kid cannot control.
Right.
I mean, I can say this because it's happened to me. When I don't eat well, when certain things are out of balance, like my mind becomes so difficult to control.
Yeah.
And, like meditation for me when I'm out of balance is literally like trying to get on the horse that's trying to keep me off. And I've learned how to do it, but it's not easy.
Yeah.
And there are other times like I don't even need to meditate because I'm already so calm and balance just my mind.
Naturally, yeah.
I might as well be meditating, except I'm not.
Right.
All things to reconsider or reconfigure how we're seeing these things. And I think that will create a space of empathy, really, first and foremost.
Yeah.
Of why these kids behave the way they do and why they act the way they do and all of the weird, crazy things that they're doing that make no sense start making sense.
Right. Yes. And we can have fewer judgments about it and just kind of be able to be more in the moment. And I have to say, I mean, I have so many tools. Parenting tools and mindfulness tools. And there's still moments for me with Hunter where in the moment, I don't utilize those. And it takes me a minute and I'm going, in that Roblox scenario, I'm going, okay, well, Hunter, honey, he's crying, he's carrying on. I'm going, sweetie, daddy's going to play with you. It's okay. I'm trying to reason with him. And it takes me a minute to be like, oh, hold on a minute. This isn't what's going on. And I got to redirect myself. So I think for parents, it's something that we just have to constantly be reminding ourselves of. And the more we educate ourselves and understand these things, the more able we are in the moment to use that knowledge to kind of put it into practice and help our kids kind of ride that wave when it hits, it can be intense. And I've learned for Hunter, the absolute worst thing I can do is try to reason with him. It's like everyone kind of knows that in general. Like when your child's having a tantrum, there's no left braining their way out of it. And so, it's that nonverbal communication and just kind of holding that space in terms of your energy and just your physical attunement and your physical closeness of being like, I'm here for you. You're going to let it all out and you do you right now. and whatever you have to do, it's okay. I can hold this space for you. And that requires a pretty intense ability in the parent to be able to tolerate their child's really intense, big emotions. And if this is a side note and a different conversation, but if a parent hasn't done their own work on their childhood and on any kind of trauma that they went through, they're going to have a very difficult time in those moments. And I know this from firsthand experience. And I have done a lot of work at this point, and those moments are still hard for me. I have a lot of tools that I use just to regulate myself to hold space when Hunter is falling apart. And luckily, and we're going to circle back around to this because thanks to all of your help and the interventions we've been doing, those extremely dysregulated moments have dramatically decreased. So where they used to happen multiple times a day, those are happening maybe once every couple weeks, and it's much easier to manage. But that was a little bit of a side note. But I do really appreciate that point you're making about, for parents and kids to kind of take the pressure off it being your fault or your child's fault. When there is this pattern of dysregulation that your child's had for many years, there is something beneath the surface that's going on that needs to be corrected. And it's not, I was actually just talking to a girlfriend whose teenage son is experiencing a tremendous amount of anxiety. And, we were talking about all the different pieces of the puzzle. And I was saying, have you considered that there's a physical piece? And she said, no, we haven't talked about that yet, or our doctor hasn't, mentioned that. And I said, it's not that it's a silver bullet, that it's like, oh, all of a sudden you're going to identify this imbalance and boom, your child's going to be, a different kid. But it's a very important piece to consider when you're putting together, or I should say, when you're trying to tease apart your child's story, to find ways to intervene and help them have more optimal functioning. So, yeah.
I think that I love how you've kind of presented this, because it is really a matter of understanding the child's story. And I think for some parents, if they can pay really close attention to the child, it's actually almost a yes, there's an imbalance there or not.
Yeah.
And I think if parents could start becoming attuned to this, it literally becomes like, yeah, that's my kid. And part of that's my kid is, so we touched on the fact that a lot of these kids that have these kind of thyroid imbalances later on were also the kiddos at around 3 years of age that had the epic tantrums. So usually their tantrums are like 30 to 60 minutes. And then somewhere around 4 to 5, it kind of chills out a little bit, or it doesn't. And now let's say you got the 8-year-old who has the OCD, the perseveration, the emotional lability. The thing that's really interesting about these kiddos is they also, along with that, there's almost like a double-edged sword. The opposite side of this coin is these kids also happen to be highly, highly imaginative. They're highly, highly creative. So, a lot of the parents I talk to whose kids have these imbalances, when I ask them about that, they're like, they're the most creative kid of the bunch. A lot of these kids have very intense dreams. So TRH that controls all of these things for whatever reason that I still don't understand, is it also happens to cause a lot of dreams. Oftentimes they happen to be in color. So it's a very weird description, but it actually is very applicable to this population of kids.
That's so interesting.
So they have a lot of dreams. A lot of times if you ask them about their dreams tend to be in colors. Sometimes they're flying in their dreams. And there's this clustering of symptoms. And if you're a parent out there and you're listening, you're like, you dream? Yeah. Your dreams in color? Yeah. And then you look and you're like, yeah, my kid perseverates all the time. Yeah, they flip out sometimes for no reason. And my 8-year-old is still having tantrums that last 45 minutes. It's probably a thyroid issue.
Right.
These kinds of findings are not coincidental. It's not just this random collection of things that we, piece together. For various reasons that I was trained, these all come out of the physiology. Right. And the coolest part is that there's actually something that can be done about this. Plants, especially this plant called oat straw, parents can actually buy this in bulk herb on their own. It turns out that oat straw happens to be a very wonderful thyroid supporter. A lot of the times what happens, sometimes in the matter of weeks, and I see this in a lot of the patients I work with, that once we balance the thyroid, all of a sudden the kid is having less tantrums, less emotional lability. They're still imaginative because we're not messing with their thyroid hormones. What we're doing is using plants to balance their own systems within. So we don't give them thyroid replacement. We don't block thyroid activity. These plants literally go in there and just kind of massage things or optimize things to then allow the hormones to balance out.
So they're working with the body. It's not something synthetic, or it's not a pharmaceutical. It's a natural plant that is working to balance out the thyroid's activity. And I have a question. So in those kids, is it that their thyroid is underactive that's causing that, or is it not so black or white? Okay.
It's suboptimal is really the way to look at it. Sometimes when you say underactive, it's almost suggestive of a hypothyroid picture. So these kids are not hypothyroid. To go and measure the thyroid hormones will be normal in range, but the amount of impact they're having on the body is not optimal. How I came to know of this is there's two brilliant physicians from 20, 30 years ago in France that literally came up with this entire idea. And they were smart enough to realize, we have to understand how much activity, so at the cell level, how much activity does the body need from the thyroid, and then look all the way down from the cells all the way up to the high pituitary hypothalamus, and look at how all of these connections are happening.
Are working together. So it's looking at how the body is working, all the different systems in the body are working together. It's not just isolating, how's your thyroid working? Oh, it's normal. Okay, you're fine. It's saying, how is your thyroid working in conjunction with all these other, which I don't know what they are, but important systems that influence your development and your behavior. So that's the picture of kind of the suboptimal thyroid function that appears to be normal in a standard lab workup, but is not optimal for the child's functioning and then results in some of these behavioral issues. Is there another side of that where the thyroid is not optimal, but it is more of a hyperthyroid type situation?
Yeah. So you can also get thyroid overactivation. And this is where things get actually even a little bit more interesting. So it turns out that the hormones are all connected to one another. So it's not like the thyroid lives by itself or this hormone lives by themselves.
Right.
They are all interconnected. They can all influence one another. And a very powerful connection is actually the adrenal glands and the thyroid. So the adrenal glands are another very, very important gland for us to talk about. So they're these tiny little organs that sit above our kidneys. And they basically produce some of the most valuable hormones in the body. Cortisol is probably the most important of all of these hormones.
Right.
The way to consider what cortisol is, I'm sure parents have used hydrocortisone, for instance, or maybe their kids had some kind of breathing issue and they had to get prednisone.
Right.
All of these are basically corticosteroids, which are basically steroids that the body is producing to do all kinds of different activities. And one of them is to suppress inflammation. To understand the importance of the adrenal glands, I'll give you a story that I remember from my residency. So I think in my second year, I was working in the baby ICU, and all of a sudden they rushed in this little baby who was, I think, 7 days old, and this baby was literally dying. Like blood pressure was nil, blood sugar was pretty much gone. The baby was having trouble breathing, was totally like altered. We had to put intubate, do all of these things. And the most awful thing. Literally, the baby was on death's doorstep. And it turns out that this baby had a congenital or genetic defect in their adrenal glands, and that baby's adrenal glands could not produce the hormones that baby needed to survive. And the reason why, for instance, we do the newborn screenings is because we want to try to catch those genetic defects early enough before it kills the baby. And literally these defects, once they kick in, within 36 hours, a healthy baby, seemingly baby, can pass, which is horrible. The adrenal glands are that important. Without the adrenal glands functioning optimally, if they never, heavens forbid, fail, we would die. Now, again, just like the thyroid discussion, the way in medicine we look at things is we say, well, if you're not dying, then your adrenal glands must be functioning okay, and therefore it's normal. Except that's not the case. And the part that's really weird is in at least the adult holistic medicine, we talk about adrenal fatigue often, right? A lot of people have heard of that term, and tired, wired. We talk about that, but somehow when it comes to pediatrics and especially kids' behavioral issues, we somehow think that it's impossible for kids to have adrenal issues, which is totally weird.
I'm bringing in like the sensory connection too, because it makes a lot of sense to me in that context. When you have kids who are in a more hyper aroused state all the time, because their body is taking in all this input and not being able to process it efficiently, and it's causing a reaction of like, oh, this is dangerous, or this is a threat, and that's the state they're in, then it makes sense that would naturally impact or involve their adrenals.
That's a really good point, right? Most of our sensory kids are kind of high strung. They're in that hyper-aroused
right.
state. And the part that's really kind of the kick in the pants, if you want to say, is when you think about the adrenal glands, there are these tiny little organs who are uber sensitive. The adrenal glands are so sensitive that any little thing can throw them off. So you got this kid that's basically living in a state of chronic stress because of sensory overwhelm and so forth.
Right.
50+% of kids, at least in my observation, have metabolic issues, right? We talked about how the mitochondria and metabolic issues and things.
Right.
Well, it turns out the adrenal glands are crazy sensitive to metabolic issues. And the way they produce their hormones. So just to kind of backtrack a little bit, the adrenal glands basically produce cortisol. They produce equivalents of testosterone, estrogen, and a few other things like epinephrine or adrenaline. These things don't just pop out of thin air. The adrenal glands have to suck in cholesterol from the bloodstream. So they have to pull cholesterol into their core, and then they go through, I think, about 15 different enzyme conversions. So they take cholesterol, change it a little bit, 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 and then they do that about 10 to 12 times or 15 times, and then they spit out cortisol. All of that conversion. So if you think of like a conveyor belt, right, and then there's a thing moving along, and then people are constantly working and assembling and changing, that takes energy. It takes a lot of energy.
Right.
And if you got this double whammy where the mitochondria are already kind of puny to begin with, because genetics and whatever else that we talked about before, so the conveyor belt is already kind of half functional. Right. And then you add stress on top of that. That is the recipe for the adrenal glands just saying, you know what, I quit.
Right.
This is just too much.
Right.
And you get this tired but wired picture. Now, this also, just like the thyroid, has a very unique presentation to it. So kids wake up crabby in the morning, so they've had a good night's sleep, so it's not an airway issue or anything like that. They're sleeping solidly, but despite 10 hours of sleep or whatever, they still either wake up grumpy, so they're irritable in the morning, or they're just super tired, and it takes them half an hour to peel themselves out of bed. Usually by around 2 or 4 o'clock, the same kids either need to take a nap, they slow down, or they also become irritable. So like afternoons are just a lot more difficult for them. And the weirdest part of this is usually 70% of the time, these kids get this second wind where they're just kind of tired, and the afternoons are just kind of like by the time they're supposed to go to bed, it's like they just had coffee and they're just wired to go. When they should actually be winding down to sleep, they're actually in this state of crazy arousal.
Right. Yeah, that's my younger son, Cruz, to a T. He wakes up, he's not really in a bad mood when he wakes up, but he's very he's just kind of chugging along. He's not that cooperative. He'll say to me, "Mom, I'm just tired," and even today, the boys were on their little recess from remote learning, and I said, "Okay, go ride your bikes around the block." Well, Hunter skips out there, puts on his stuff, and Cruz looks at me and he goes, "Mom, I'm way too tired." It's like, and I'm all, "Really? It's like 9 a.m. You just had breakfast." And so he gets that way, and then he'll kind of perk up. Then in the afternoons, yes, same thing. To get him to go on a bike ride with us in the late afternoon is like, it takes so much effort. And then right at bedtime, that kid is running up and down the hallways. He's loud. He's jumping on the bed. It's like he just gets this surge of energy, and it's so hard for him to wind down. And so this is something that we are addressing with you through the supplements, but he totally fits that picture. So I kind of have both, one of each in terms of these patterns that you're identifying. So for parents who are saying, yeah, my kid fits that profile too, is there something plant-wise that's different from the kind of less optimal thyroid that helps bolster that type of kid system?
Let's talk about the chart.
Yeah.
So there's a plant that's actually very easily available. It's called black currant. So black and then currant, or the Latin name is rides, rides, nigrum. And there's a few companies that make this, and it comes in this form of a glycerin extract, and it's called a gemotherapy. And the Europeans, again, were the smart people that figured out that these plants have these abilities to actually support organs like the adrenal glands. And rides is probably the perfect example of that.
Right.
And if parents type that in on Amazon, there's a website called Pure Formulas. You'll find a few different companies. One of them being Royal, the other one is Boiron, that actually make these diluted extracts of these plants.
Right.
And for kids, they can actually buy these and give somewhere between 1 to 3 milliliters of that to the child in the morning. Because I found that, one, these extracts are not as concentrated as they can be, and two, fairly costly. We actually decided I've been making our own tinctures for a while.
Right.
Because we actually, our pharmacy that makes this for us, they actually import the plants directly from growers in Europe. They're able to give us prices that are actually way better than what you can find for the most part online.
Yeah.
So for families that want, they can also buy, so if they go to store.holistickids.com, we have the adrenal mix, which is a blend of black currant and oak. Black currant is a really fantastic adrenal adaptogen, if you want to say it. So it supports the adrenal glands where it needs it, and also kind of calms things down. Oak is, if you imagine the mighty oak, it's this solid plant that happens to really tonify the core of the adrenal glands and really just gives the adrenal glands that oomph. What I found is if you do kind of a 70-30 blend, which is basically what our adrenal blend is, that ratio, that combination actually works better than either plant by themselves. But these options are there. And the coolest part is when you got that kid that's sluggish in the morning, crashes in the afternoons, gets that second wind, and then they're really wired but also tired. In that piece, if you give them the adrenal support, usually within 1 to 2 weeks, and I don't know if you saw this in your boys, within 1 to 2 weeks, all of a sudden, it's like a new child emerges. And they're not that sluggish in the mornings. They've got more energy in the afternoons. And the coolest part is, just like with the thyroid, when we talked about the accelerator, the same thing is with the adrenal glands, except with the adrenal glands, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-flight nervous system, is what accelerates ultimately the adrenal glands. So the more able the adrenal glands are, the less sympathetic drive the body needs to exert onto the adrenal glands to keep them going, which naturally, on one hand, gives your child more vitality, they have more energy, they have more resilience, but what you also find is the kid that's less prone to have outbursts, less prone to react. And because the sympathetic nervous system happens to also influence the thyroid, so going back to what you were talking about, the
the hyperthyroid.
So it turns out that when the adrenal glands are tapped out, because the entire nervous system, the high up hypothalamic level, is really buzzing, that actually can overstimulate the thyroid gland. And I see this in quite a few kids, where they end up getting also a perseveration and OCD and all of these other things. And it's because one system is off, that then tips another system out of balance. And one thing causes another thing, which could then cause another thing, and there's like a cascade of events. Just happens that yesterday I actually had a guy that I was helping who has OCD, but his OCD is very unique. So the thyroid OCD is more of the emotional overthinking. So it's the mind that can't stop. What's interesting is there's also another form of OCD that looks very similar to this, but there's a degree of explosiveness, there's an aggression to it. Some of these kids also have these intrusive thoughts. So it's almost like, I hate to use the word possessed, but there's a very weird paranoia. So it's not just anxious, but they're literally almost paranoid. Some of them hear voices, some of them see things. So there's borderline hallucination. It turns out that in those cases, those kids have what's more PANS or PANDAS, so the pediatric acute neuropsychiatric syndrome that they call it. So chronic infections, inflammatory responses also can trigger a very strange form of OCD.
Okay.
And I love that you brought this up, because these are actually the two most common manifestations of OCD in kids.
Interesting.
And when you really come to look at them, you'll actually see that they're quite different. So on one side, there's this aggression, explosiveness. The kids are, I hate to say this, but they're borderline psychotic. Like, these poor kids are literally going crazy.
Right.
And if you see that pattern, that's not the thyroid. That's actually some kind of chronic infections, whether it's strep, Lyme, mold, other co-infections. Viruses can sometimes do this. Whereas the kids that have the thyroid imbalance, they don't have that extreme explosiveness where they want to hit you or attack you. It's more they're just kind of nervous, and that's anticipation anxiety. It's just overthinking, but not boom, explode into rage. That's a way to actually differentiate these two different phenomena that have very different reasons for why they occur.
Yeah, that's such an important distinction.
There's definitely a genetic component to it. And, a lot of families joke, and I joke, the apple doesn't fall far from the fall.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we say that all the time. Or I say it all the time about my kids. Yeah. Yeah.
But, so we get these. So when you look at this, you have constitutions, which are basically makeups of people in terms of how they function. So for instance, it turns out the highly sensitive kids, the amount of adrenaline that they have in their brains and in their bodies are different than other people, which is what causes them to actually be a lot more high-strung. That's what causes some of the hypervigilance. So if you look at, the average population in, a perfect example, like my wife is exponentially more chill than me, which is part of what makes us agree. And some of that, I realized, there are crazy little details that I will notice. And I'm like, how did you notice that? She's like, why would I notice that?
Totally.
Like, it was right there. She's like, why would I notice that? It's being together with her. I'm like, oh my God, not everyone is wired crazy like that. My brain catches everything. I notice every single little detail, which is the description of the highly sensitive person.
Yes.
So the highly sensitive person also with the emotionality, the sensitivity, the imagination. And that also is part of our thyroid tending to run faster than others. So we have more adrenaline, we've got a more sensitive, reactive thyroid. While let's say the average population's thyroid speed is set at 55, we tend to run at 75 or 70 miles an hour. It's still technically normal, but they're just different set points that we have. We also tend to have a higher degree of metabolic issues and mitochondrial errors, which ultimately leads to adrenal issues. We tend to detoxify less effectively than other people, so we end up getting in trouble with toxicity. If the highly sensitive kids get hit with mold, absolute disaster. It's really weird. It's the same pattern that keeps showing up. There are families of 6 people, and everyone is fine except the highly sensitive kid is the one that's going absolutely berserk. And it turns out that for whatever weird reason, this same constitution also has a very poor ability to detoxify. So they don't handle mold, they don't handle toxins, we tend to have weaker guts. So there's this almost like fragility to us, which is kind of, I guess you could say, is genetic. The cool part of this, so all of that negative talk is part of this, we also tend to be the innovators, the leaders. If you look at a lot of the scientists, a lot of the people, and some of them, go into the Asperger's domain. When you look at Asperger's, what is that? That's like the highly sensitive person plus, So these are all things that when you start looking at who are the people that come up with the novel, cool ideas that change the world, typically it's the highly sensitive kids or the highly sensitive people.
Yeah.
And part of why I love our discussions and I love working with these kids is we have ways we can balance these kids. We can support the mitochondria, we can support detox, we can support the adrenal glands, we can support the thyroid. All of these tools are available to us.
Yeah.
And when we know how to leverage these tools, and we know precisely what areas these highly sensitive people need their balancing in, and you bring that crazy bronco down to the resilient but calm force that the kid can get on and they can gallop. All of a sudden, really cool things start happening.
Yeah. And you just open up the potential, because I think what happens a lot, and I am a highly sensitive person myself. And yes, so that's why I always say, like, especially Hunter's personality and just, just genetically, I think he inherited everything from me. And it's so funny because we have such a similar dynamic where my husband, August, is like, oh my God, he's so chill. And then I'm like running around like a maniac, and same exact thing. I'm so hyper attuned to everything. And he's kind of just like going about his day, like life is good, and we just have this very different dynamic. And yeah, like, Hunter is much more similar to me. And so the idea is that when you can get the body in balance, that the highly sensitive people, we're kind of just more free to tap into the really good things that go along with that, of which there are many. It just becomes really difficult when the body is out of balance, because it's like there's this kind of cloud, that you're walking under all the time, and you can't always access those really positive parts of yourself. And it's the same. I mean, I feel that personally, and I've experienced that, and I, see it in Hunter. And one of the things that's been so beautiful over the last 6 months as we've been addressing and using some of these supplemental protocols and the plant-based tinctures with Hunter is that cloud has dissipated. And, he's kind of emerged as this, those beautiful, like vibrant, just adorable parts of him are so much more present, where before they were totally there, but they were often kind of in the background of all the difficult behaviors and the real challenging behaviors. And so there's just been this shift now where that stuff is now kind of in the background. It's not completely gone, but it's not at the forefront of who he is. And I've experienced that with myself as well, as I've gotten my body more in balance. The parts of me that are, well, August would definitely say more challenging, they have subsided. And the parts of me that are fabulous and wonderful, have come more to the forefront. So it definitely is possible. And I've experienced it firsthand. Hunter has experienced it firsthand. Cruzy is experiencing it as well. We're always a work in progress, and we tease these things apart, and we intervene, and we track things. It's important when you're trying new interventions to track how it's going and track the progress, and we tweak things here and there. And just for families who are out there who are just like feeling so despondent, I think the overarching message is that there really, truly is help for your child and for you too, as a parent. And even, I know some parents listen to it like I do in all of our conversations, where I'm like, oh, that is me, and where I'm gaining insight into my own. I'm like, oh, I have mitochondrial issues. Like, okay, I need to look into this. So it's not just helpful for kids. It's, and back to the point that they don't fall far from the tree. Often, one of the parents, or maybe both of them, may have some of these underlying issues as well. And there's ways to treat it. I want to circle back to, Holistic Kids and touch on Holistic Minds, because on Holistic Kids, the website, you do have the 2 adrenal tinctures, and one is just regular adrenal support, and then the other one is called Adrenal Plus, and that's the one for kids who are more of that tired but wired profile. Is that right? Yeah.
Part of why I made that other mixture, and I've used both of these for many years, these formulas are not, any new experiments that I've done. I found that for a lot of the kids that are really wired, having just a tiny bit of a calming plant, so the Adrenal Plus has a tiny bit of FIG, it's less than, I think, 15% of the total concentration. But that 15% of that calming plant just is enough to essentially signal to their bodies, like, dude, okay, it's okay to chill out now. Like,
yeah.
The support you need, you can let your foot off the accelerator. Everything's going to be fine. And it tends to kind of hasten that relaxation that happens. So while we're providing the adrenal support, the Adrenal Plus also has a little bit of a calmative effect to just kind of expedite the calming down of the system.
Perfect. I've actually been taking the Adrenal Plus myself. But it's only been a week, so I'm going to track it and see, because I could use some of the calming.
One of the things that's kind of cool is I'm actually working with our manufacturer to come up with a higher concentration of these mixtures, so that families actually have to use essentially about half the dose of what they have to do now. So each bottle is going to go a much longer way, and the cost is pretty much going to be the same.
Oh, that's great.
I had a few families, say, well, how do I, do some of this thyroid support? So hopefully in the next 2 months or so, we'll actually be coming out with the thyroid mix, which is a blend of oat, which is the oat straw that I mentioned, along with sage, which happens to be another really fantastic thyroid supporting plant. And then 5% of that total big bottle is going to be 2 calming plants. So it's also fitting this plant called lithitree. So the thyroid, just like the Adrenal Plus, this new thyroid mix is going to provide a lot of thyroid support with just a tiny bit of okay, time to chill out.
Right.
Anyone that's interested, on our store.holistickids.com, there's a contact us option. So if you don't see it yet, you can actually just contact us and say, hey, I'm interested in the thyroid mix. And then as soon as we have it available, we can
send it out. Okay, so I want to summarize. So we have kind of a few separate pictures going on. We have the thyroid, where the child's thyroid is appearing normal, but it's not optimal. It's not functioning optimally for their particular system. And the picture around that are the pretty intense tantrums that begin maybe around 3 years old. I mean, it could be sooner. Hunters started sooner. But maybe they intensify around 3. That perseveration and kind of the mood swings, the kind of intense, like everything's fine 1 minute, and then the child goes from 0 to 60, and we have no idea why. And then once they're at 60, there's no turning back. It's just they're going to stay there for a while, and we just have to ride it out with them. And that tendency to get really fixated, what I've noticed in Hunter, and it goes hand in hand, is this rigidity, just kind of this rigid fixation on things, and kind of this really black or white or all or nothing thinking, where it's just, there's no gray. It's this way or this way, and there is no in between. It's this. Yes, and it's very rigid. So that is, am I missing any of the red flags?
The dreams.
The dreams, the vivid dreams.
70% of the time families look their kids, so the highly imaginative kids, creative kids, that's usually part of their subset and makeup.
Right.
And a lot of these kids will have very robust dreams.
And color and flying. And does that also involve nightmares? Are they more prone to nightmares? Yeah. Okay.
That's a really good point. These kids definitely have a higher propensity to have nightmares.
Yes. Which is so interesting because Hunter sometimes talks in his sleep. He's had night terrors before where Cruz never has had that, but definitely has active dreams for sure. And so for that kind of profile, the plant that is really helpful is called oat straw. And parents can contact Holistic Kids and request a thyroid tincture that has oat straw and a few other things in it, or they can right now they can buy it themselves and make a tea out of it.
So there's a bunch of places, but Mountain Rose Herbs actually is a great organic supplier. It's dirt cheap. It's like, I think for a pound of oat straw, you pay like $15. And then what you want to do is take maybe 2 teaspoons of the bulk herb, put it in a big pot of 15 ounces, 10 ounces of hot water, let it sit for about 15 minutes, strain out the herb, and then add some honey, and have your kid drink pretty much that entire amount.
Right.
It takes a little bit longer, so you're probably looking at closer to 3 or 4 weeks for the effects to kick in, sometimes sooner. Because the tinctures that we use are just way
concentrated.
But tea is a perfect place to start because one, you can't do any harm. It's super cheap and super safe.
Okay, so that's sort of the suboptimal thyroid. Then there's the kind of other profile where it's not necessarily hyperthyroid, but it's the child who is tired in the morning, even though they've had a good night's sleep. I know you've mentioned this before too, where they kind of get those dark circles under the eyes that kind of come and go. They, get some energy, but then in the afternoon, they're fatigued, tired, crashing. Then at bedtime, they're bouncing off the walls and having a hard time coming down. And for that group of kids, that's where they can use the Adrenal Plus supplement to kind of help balance, because the thyroid and the adrenals are kind of linked together. Yeah.
Just to touch on the really valuable point that you brought out. So kids that have allergies tend to get puffiness under their eyes. And usually it's a pinkish, purplish hue that's kind of boggy and persistent. Because allergies don't come and go as much.
Right.
Whereas the kids that have the adrenal issues, if they didn't get like their full, let's say 11 hours of sleep, and they only slept 8 hours or whatever happened that they got disrupted, they'll wake up with the dark circles and literally 2 hours later, it's gone.
Okay.
So there's a high degree of variability usually.
Okay.
The kids are really tapped out with their adrenal glands. Most people who have the adrenal related dark circles, if you look, the dark circles are there, and then like literally hours later, they're gone.
Okay.
So that's a higher degree of fluctuation in that.
Okay.
Yeah, the adrenal gland, the Adrenal Plus would be a fantastic mixture for them to use. Or if they want to try something on their own, blackcurrant white sniper that they can purchase online.
Okay. And I just realized I left this out. For that group too, there's a tendency towards the OCD perseveration type behaviors. And then just to reiterate the distinction you made between kids who have more of this kind of explosiveness around OCD type behaviors, that is a separate issue that can be possibly due to PANS, or is it called PANDAS, or that's the same thing?
So PANDAS is related specifically to strep.
To strep, okay, and PANS is more general.
Any kind of infectious trigger.
Gotcha.
Old Lyme, other things being part of that.
Okay.
They're basically the same family, just different reasons for why it's happening.
Okay, and I have one last question, that for parents of preteens or teenagers, do these, because being that that's, an intense time hormonally for kids, no matter what, if they have already kind of had some of these hormonal issues, and then they've never been detected, and then they hit puberty, is it common for like all hell to break loose in terms of like things just to really go intensely haywire. Have you seen teenagers or preteens in your practice who've just totally out of control behaviorally, and it's actually related to something underlying like that?
As we get older, we have a higher degree of cortex or frontal cortex kind of control, right? Mm-hmm. So wild behaviors turn into more an overt anxiety or depression.
Yes.
So they morph.
Yeah.
The teenagers experience different version of what the adolescents experience because cognitively they're in a different place of maturity and ability. But I would say that, these same issues, if they're not addressed, once kids especially hit their teenage years and now they've got these hormonal storms.
Right.
The hormonal storms could become much more lively.
Right.
I've seen actually a lot of teens and adolescents that their primary complaint is depression and anxiety.
Yeah.
It's pretty serious. Even medications don't help.
Right.
The same fundamentals are now just showing up in a different way.
At that age, it's such a difficult period of development, for kids. And then, if they've had kind of this history that's gone undetected of hormonal imbalances, and now all of a sudden they're 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, and it's just a storm on top of a storm, I can only imagine that the behaviors can be pretty intense. And like you said, different from what an 8-year-old would do, but, they may really be acting out more in very concerning ways that would be hard for parents to handle. So important to know that for parents of teenagers who are listening, that, if they are acting out and whatever it may be, if it's drugs, alcohol, they've completely shut down, they're whatever. It is worth looking into and trying to identify if there is a physical component that's exacerbating, this.
I think a way to summarize all of this, whether you've got a 6-year-old or a 16-year-old, is if they don't feel well, they can't act well.
Yep. Yeah.
And whether you've got the teen that's acting out, or all of a sudden they're doing, drugs or whatever else, if you stand back and say, well, why the hell is my kid going towards drugs? It may be just because that's the only way they know to soothe.
To feel better.
They found the soothing mechanism. They found something to help them feel better.
Totally.
Even sadly in a lot of adults, when I look at alcoholism, what creates alcoholism, a lot of people use alcohol as a medication. It's the only way they know how to soothe the pain and just comfortable feeling that they have.
Yeah.
And when you really go back in time, you'll see that these alcoholic adults were kids that also had issues. There's a lot more to the story than meets the eye.
Right.
When you really kind of unravel the picture that shows up in teenagers or certain adults, you look back, you're like, oh my God, it's the same story. It just never had an ending.
Totally.
It's just a different variation of the same thing. The toddler, the child, the adolescent, the teenager, now adult.
Right.
Same story, just a different picture.
Totally. And it's such a good point that, no matter what age the person is, everyone is just trying to find a way to either not feel something that feels really uncomfortable, or to make that feeling go away, or to somehow make their insides, feel more balanced. And sometimes, that looks like, for a child who is, doing OCD-like behavior, sometimes that has kind of a weird, soothing effect for them. Or, the child who's caught into a thought loop and can't get out, or the child who's really rigid. It's like a way of getting their needs met, or a way of sort of soothing something inside of them. Yeah, that's inflamed. And that's true for, addictions, of course. It's kind of like a brilliant coping mechanism, except it's totally dysfunctional and causes a lot more problems. But, in the immediate, it really works. And that's why so many people struggle with it. I mean, I've been open on my blog and talked about that I struggled with an eating disorder since I was a young girl. And that's another perfect example of a coping mechanism. It's a way to self-regulate, and it works. That's the thing, is it works in the moment. And so, unfortunately, these dysfunctional patterns have so many repercussions. And the thing is that there's, part of, I think, any type of dysfunction like that does involve a physical component to it. And so when you can get underneath it and start balancing that out, then the whole system just becomes more resilient. And then you don't need that coping mechanism anymore. You are able to, and I talk about this with families, and it's just a big part of the work I've done on myself personally, is that you're able to just be more comfortable being uncomfortable and just tolerating that discomfort, whatever it is, whether it's emotional discomfort, and the body, and over time you have less discomfort because your system is becoming more resilient and healthier. And it's a process, but it builds on itself. And I just, there's so many pieces of the puzzle for any type of dysfunction. And it's never just, this one thing happened to me when I was a child and it caused all these things. No, I mean, yes. So it's okay. Yes, there may have been emotional trauma. There may have been ongoing emotional trauma. There also, the body and the mind are interconnected and working in conjunction. So, whatever genetic disposition you came in with could be contributing. And then you had these experiences that were very dysregulating. Then your system was already a little off and you didn't get the support you needed. And suddenly, you're this teenager or an adult who's just kind of grasping at straws and doing the best they can. And so when we can dial this all the way back, and that's what families are watching for, because they have kids who their development is concerning. And so they're watching at the perfect point right now, because this is the point where you can intervene early for your child and really start to help their physical nervous system become more imbalanced. And again, it's not like it's going to solve everything in one fell swoop, but it will start to make things so much easier.
It'll make all of the cognitive tools, all the psychological tools, that much more effective. Mm-hmm. One thing I guess I just want to highlight, because I love everything you said, and I think you said it perfectly. We still live in a world where we think that everything that's mental is either our thoughts or just our brain chemistry. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those two things, and that's all there is. Mm-hmm. I think that's a big fundamental error in how we're looking at mental health in general, especially behavioral health. Mm-hmm. And I love what you said, that as we support the system, we create resilience and vitality and just help the human being that's experiencing these things feel better. Mm-hmm. When we have more energy, when we have more vitality, when we just have more life, that elevated experience of life, which then elevates our mood, changes a lot of other elements of our psyche, cognition, and behavior. And when that happens, when that fundamental shift happens from state of illness, weakness, fatigue, low vitality, low energy, to high vitality, vibrant energy, great experience just physically, all of the other psychological pieces start falling into place. And it's not to say this takes the place of the cognitive behavioral piece, because you still need the parenting tools, you still need the cognitive tools. Like, all of those things need to be there. They just become a hell of a lot more effective and a hell of a lot more efficient, because now you're not fighting the physiology. And when you try to fight physiology, you lose. Like, it becomes, unless you're like a Buddhist monk and you can just meditate your way through, a train wreck, most people, myself included, it's really hard to use cognitive tools when the physiology is right.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Bringing that combination of things together creates a really beautiful synergy that produces some really cool results when everything gets dialed in.
Yeah. No, that's the perfect point to end on.
Well, I want to share one more thing.
Oh, yeah, please.
Audience. So it took me only about a year and a half of pestering my mentor to release some of the calculations he has. So the same brilliant physicians, Dr. Jura Ford and Ross, that came up with this entire philosophy of endocrinology and how the hormones impact our system. They were the ones that mapped out these clustering of issues from, the imagination and dreams.
Right.
Everything that I shared, I learned from my mentor, who learned it from them. These same guys actually were really smart enough to actually find novel ways to also assess hormone functioning. So through basic labs, nothing fancy, like a basic blood count with differential, basic TSH, this hormone enzyme called creatine kinase, enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. They basically figure out this way to indirectly measure the effects of the hormones. And they have this system that is one of my primary tools, because most hormones you can't measure directly. It's like trying to chase a cheetah. It's hard to track it accurately. These guys basically figured out ways to check the body's physiology and say, well, if this hormone impacts this enzyme in this way, instead of measuring the hormone that goes up and down all the time, let me measure the enzyme. They came up with this very novel system called the biology of functions to actually measure hormones indirectly, to do it for essentially no cost, a fraction of the cost, because you can run any of these labs through Quest LabCorp. Usually insurance covers it. And what's really cool is after pestering my mentor for over a year, he has finally agreed to actually allow us to use these calculations as part of Holistic Minds. So for families that say, well, this is kind of cool, but I'm still not sure exactly what's going on with my kid, and I'm not sure, do they have an adrenal imbalance? Is it more a thyroid imbalance? Do I need to do this or that? Part of what we'll be doing as part of Holistic Minds is actually having that integrated into the system. So any parent anywhere can go to their local doctor and say, hey, can you run these tests for me? And then those labs can actually get updated or uploaded into our system. The system can run these calculations and then give parents a response of, your kid probably has some degree of a thyroid imbalance. Consider this implementation. So
that's
I'm really
amazing.
excited to be sharing that. I think it'll be a very valuable tool for many families. And it'll just be included as part of our system that people can use.
So great. It's so amazing. And I'll say that from a personal experience standpoint, I have been working with a doctor who also trained with your mentor, I think. Dr. Pratha is her name. And she uses the biology of functions. And through that, she has really been able to help identify some imbalances in my system and help me correct them. And it's been making a tremendous difference in my overall health and well-being. So that's an amazing thing to be able to offer families. And anyone who's tuned in to our previous interviews has heard about Holistic Minds. But if this is your first one, go online and Google holisticminds.com or type it in. And it's holistic with a W, so WHOL. And sign up for Dr. K's newsletter. It's there's already resources available to families who go on and want to look. And soon to come is an entire system that families can be a part of that will ultimately give you this roadmap to follow for your child's healing. So there's Dr. K and his brilliant cousin have created this amazing, using artificial intelligence, have created this algorithm that's pretty much like taking Dr. K's brain and like putting it in the computer. And through a series of questions, it will help you determine what is actually going on with your child and whether or not he does have a metabolic issue or hormonal imbalance or sensory issues, or there's two more areas that I'm missing, structural issues. and gut and immune. So yeah, explain more.
We actually have 15 different parameters at this point that the system will be checking. And part of the reason why we went there in the first place is ultimately there's just too much information. Even like we've been talking for a while now, like just talking about the thyroid and adrenal glands is a lot of information.
Yeah.
And what I've realized over time is when I try to bombard families with everything at the same time, it's too much. So the whole purpose behind Holistic Minds and this entity that'll be families will be interacting with called Alfred is for the system to basically be able to tease out the details of the most relevant points. So the system will ask, about sleep and then the adrenal glands and the thyroid glands and gut. We actually are screening for PANS and PANDAS. So the system will actually be able to even differentiate between a thyroid issue and PANS and PANDAS based on their presentation. So by asking very precise, specific questions and hopefully not too painful a way, the system will start helping parents gain clarity. So instead of parents having to fumble their way through this and read tons of books and sit there and say, okay, does my kid have a thyroid issue? Do they have an adrenal issue? Do they have a gut issue? Do they have this? Do they have that? We take all of that complexity out and try to make it as simple as possible because one, just working with a child that's struggling is already a ton of work. And then figuring out what to do to sort all of this out is really difficult. So I want everyone to be able to have success, and I want every child to ultimately heal as effectively as possible. And really the only way to do that for every child anywhere on this planet is to leverage technology and just make this available to everyone.
Yeah, and accessible. And that's what's so remarkable about it. Because, I have people from England, from Australia, from Europe contacting me and saying, I can't find a doctor like this. There's no one can help me here. And, I've said, okay, well, just call Dr. K, he'll help you. But it's really hard for families who live in other parts of the world, who live in other parts of the country and are like, I don't know who to turn to. I've turned to this doctor, I've turned to that doctor. No one can kind of figure out or even give me an idea of where to start with my child and help. And that's exactly what Holistic Minds is providing for families and will provide is just access to a system and basically Dr. K's brain in computer form that can really help tease all of this apart for you and give you a roadmap and a plan to follow. And so that you're not just, shooting arrows in the dark and hoping one of them hits, which is what so many families are doing at this point, just trying this intervention, that intervention, consulting with the therapist, the OT, the pediatrician, there's 12 different experts. Everyone has a different opinion. And meanwhile, this child is, losing their childhood, that's a dramatic way to put it, but for some kids, it's not far from the truth, and for some parents. So, it's so exciting and so amazing that you're going to be able to incorporate the biology of functions into that. And it's on the horizon. It's coming soon.
The two things. One, the goal of Holistic Minds is not to take the place of the physician, but to allow families anywhere to work with their trusted doctor.
Right.
We basically just help them find the right information that they can work with their local practitioner to implement wherever they are.
Right.
And, Holistic Minds isn't about me. I happen to just have an encyclopedia of knowledge from a lot of really smart doctors. And that's why we call it Holistic Minds.
Yeah.
It's literally an amalgam of countless really brilliant people that I've been able to learn from. And our goal is, once we've got the system set up, to allow it to continue learning from other smart people that I haven't yet interacted with, so that the system can just keep getting smarter and smarter and smarter and smarter, and at the same time provide really excellent access to information for hopefully very little cost.
Yeah. Oh, it's so exciting. I'm really so thrilled that you have done this and that you're working on this and that it's going to be available to families. And these conversations, I think, are so important and so helpful. And, there'll hopefully be more to come. Thank you so much, Dr. K. Yes, it's been great talking to you as always. I always learn so much. I am so grateful.